I, of course, have gone back to Japan repeatedly. I probably lived 7.5 or 8 years of my life in Japan over, uh, not recently, but pretty solidly in the 80s and 90s. I was there. Recently, I haven't gone back so much, just now and then, because I'm not any longer doing any research there. But the second, I did the work on the East Asian medical system, and then I did a small research project which involved school refusal syndrome. And then for my first sabbatical leave, I started out on another major project. And this is a project about menopause. And the reason I got into this is because my colleague in Manitoba, Patricia Corford, was talking to me about a very large menopause study that she was part of with more than 1,000 Manitoban women. And she was working with a biostatistician in Boston, Sonia McKinley, whose sample of menopausal women was big. It was, I think, about 6,000 women in her sample. And I was planning what to do for my sabbatical research, and I thought, well, maybe this is something that I should do, that we should make it into a comparative study, because that might make it even more interesting. They were already getting some very interesting data. And so they thought this was a great idea. And my sample ended up being 1,200 Japanese women subdivided into farming women, factory women, and middle-class housewives, and a few geisha and a few fishing women who were wives of fishermen. So they were distributed in many parts of Japan as well. But they are all of these women are aged 45 to 55 inclusively in all three samples. And we won't go into all these details today, but let me just say that it turned out to be a very, very robust sample statistically, and nobody has ever questioned that. Nobody has ever had we've never had any epidemiologists saying, but you didn't do this and you didn't do that. So these comparative samples have stood up and they've stood to the test from the hard number crunchers thus far without any problem. So what I found, and of course I had to translate the questionnaire into, there were two aspects to the research. One was a major questionnaire that was distributed to the involved women, and it had already been used in Boston and Manitoba, so I had to get it translated into Japanese, and I did a pre-run of about 20 or 30 people to make sure that the Japanese was working okay. But of course it didn't surprise me at all, but some of it turned out to be extraordinarily difficult to translate because there was no obvious word, for example, for the very common symptom at menopause of a hot flash. So in Japanese there's everyday language of saying kyu na nekkan, which means you suddenly get hot, but you say that if you've got a fever, or you say that if you've been drinking alcohol in the evening, or if you get into the hot Japanese bath, you use terms like that. Kyuni atsukunatta. They have expressions like that which mean I suddenly get hot or I got hot, but none of that means a hot flash. Although, of course, when women got a hot flash, they would use one of those expressions, but it had all these other meanings associated with it, and they still do. It's very ordinary language, everyday language. So that was an indicator to me that there was something interesting going on here. And so the first part of the study was administering this questionnaire and getting the answers, and the second part of the study was ethnographic interviews with approaching 100 women, which I did mostly with just one fantastic research assistant. I mean, we did it bits separately, but I think we employed some Japanese assistants as well, but I think we decided that didn't work so well. Anyway, we did all of these, all this ethnographic research, and I, in addition, interviewed a good number of doctors at meetings or in their offices, OBGYNs and so on. And the long and short of this is that very quickly, it was quite a scene, because this was a long time ago. This was in the 1970s when I was collecting this data, late 1970s. We didn't really have computers, and we had to use punch cards to punch card the questionnaires responses, right? And this was going to take ages. And so I would collect all the punch cards, and then I had to ship them back to Manitoba, praying that they would get there, because that was our data, right? Of ages and ages of work, but it did all work out all right. And then there were the books that people had actually filled out. They'd written in the original books, which I probably still have some of them around the house here that were kept for ages and ages, because they were so rich. Because Japanese take research like that very seriously, and they make every effort to fill out exactly what they're asked to do and so on, unlike in some other countries where people won't do it properly. So very quickly I could see that there was a low reporting of hot flashes. It remained remarkably low. And it turned out it turned out that in this particular study, only 19% of this sample of women who were in what's called perimenopause or postmenopause. In other words, they had essentially been through menopause. Only 19% of them had ever had a hot flash. That is very, very low compared with North America and with many other parts of the world. In North America, in both the Boston sample and the Manitoba sample, it's more like 60%. It's not as high as people think it is, but it's up in the 60s. And recently, or not in the intervening years, there's been research done by anthropologists now in several parts of the world following up on this research, and it seems that in some parts of the world, parts of the Middle East, it seems as though there's actually higher experience of hot flashes. So there's obviously regional variation, and I deliberately do not use the word ethnic, because it isn't, of course, limited to Japan is this and America is that and Lebanon is the other. This is there are regional variations, and what we are fairly certain it is associated with in many instances is to do with diet, lifelong diet. And a physical anthropologist, Melissa Melby, has followed up on my research in Japan, and her Japanese is superb, and she's done a lot of research in Japan, including drawing blood samples, which of course I never did. And she is working out the biological mechanisms which do involve the consumption of soy products, which probably facilitate the way in which the dropping estrogen levels of women in middle age go down really rather smoothly in Japan. And in other parts of the world, it's much more bumpy, and that's when people get these hot flashes and they get the night sweats and the complaints that middle-aged women complain about and their husbands complain about and so on. So this was extraordinarily interesting finding. And I'd, of course, gone into the field assuming that what I was looking at was a cultural difference, that this was fully a cultural difference, and it was about the expectations that people have about this not being a bad time of life. And the Japanese women had all said to me, oh, you know, that's nothing. I'm much more concerned about the fact that my husband has to work 50, 60 hours a week, and that my kids aren't doing well in high school, and that sort of stuff, or grandma. What I'm mostly concerned about is grandpa and grandpa and they're getting demented and I have to look after them. Who cares about a hot flash? And when I interviewed the Japanese doctors, one or two of them very cheekily said to me, "What is the matter with Western women? Why do they make such a fuss about hot flashes?" But these were signals to me that there's something really different going on here. And of course, Western women can endure as well as any other women, and there's something really different happening here. And when I would interview people right here in Montreal, I could see them pouring with sweat in front of me as I was interviewing them. And I never came across that in Japan, ever. So I became convinced fairly quickly that this was not merely a cultural phenomenon. Of course it's partly cultural because of expectations and on the assumption that women in Japan have better things to do with their life than fuss about their own bodies. But it's also, there is a biological difference. There really, really is a biological difference. And it's not because they're Japanese, but it's a regional association and it's associated with dietary practices and so on. And when I started looking in the history of menopause in Japan, it became clear that the Japanese doctors had been to Germany in what's called the Meiji era in the 19th century. They'd been to Germany and learnt a lot of stuff from German doctors. And they had come back with ideas for the first time about the middle part of the life cycle being something that one should be somewhat concerned about. And they got their ideas mostly from Germany at that time. But this was long before there became a very large interest in the end of menstruation, and that, of course, was driven by the production of medication, by hormone replacement therapy, which didn't come in until they started playing around with that in the 30s and 40s, but it didn't really get promoted until the 60s a great deal. And that drove the menopause industry and drove concern of women about having to see doctors at this time of the life cycle and whether they should take HRT or not. And that same drive never happened in Japan. Japanese doctors were very, very reluctant to hand out medication, and in any case found very, very few women coming to them complaining about symptoms. So I then had to write all this up and think it through, and in writing this book, which is the product of this research, called Encounters with Aging, Mythologies of Menopause in Japan and North America, and there's Salvador Dali at the top there with one of his women. And I will take the liberty of saying that this book has won, I think, 8 or 9 prizes. It was including the Staley Award, which is the big anthropology one. And the reason I think, in retrospect, that this happened is because it does link cultural and social culture with biology in a way that we anthropologists had been so afraid of doing. And I think that's what struck people. I know that that's the case with the Staley group who selected this book. And so I had to think of how best to present this, and I ended up coming up with a concept which I called local biologies. And this concept has caught on and is now appeared in more than 100 books and articles written by medical anthropologists in different parts of the world. Of course, it's not used in exactly the way I used it, but I don't care about that. It's that's a good concept, can be flexible and can be used in numbers of ways, but it certainly has caught on. So let me just tell you what I tried to set down as being something called local biology, and let me also point out that what I was concerned about all the time was not having Japanese women and their accounts of their bodies appearing as exotic and odd. What I wanted to do, especially because we had this data from Boston and Manitoba, although that was all statistical data, not interviews, but of course I interviewed doctors here too. What I wanted to do was to de-center the white body as being the norm, i.e. the biomedical body, which is always a white body and is often actually a white male body, but for menopause you can't make it into a male body very well. But that is the center of this. That's the standardized body for which you develop medications and prescribe medications and so on. And I wanted to de-center that body because I felt very strongly that what we were dealing with was biological difference. And people started getting anxious about this, of course, because we anthropologists don't like the idea. And in fact, my concept of local biologies has been criticized by one or two people because of this very danger, that one shouldn't play with this stuff. It's just playing with fire. But I did, and this is the result, and it's being picked up and spread more and used in very interesting ways, and I'll mention another couple of ways, but first let me tell you what I think I mean by local biologies. I've created the concept especially to try and express what I understood is as a mutual constitution of subjective bodily experience with associated language usage and embedded in historical, political, social, and medical contexts. In other words, it's and in this particular case, it's at the midlife female transition. But it's a concept that doesn't have to just be used for middle-aged women. It's something that could be used in any situation where you're trying to account for subjective experiences of bodily difference, i.e. after massive trauma or violence or starvation or anything like that. You're trying to account for your subjective experience, and it needs to be contextualized in an environment which takes historical, social, and cultural factors into account, and language usage as well. So I say more generally, local biologies has come to be used to refer to the way in which the embodied experience of physical sensations, including those of well-being, health, and illness, is in part informed by the material body itself, which in turn is contingent on evolutionary, environmental, and individual variables. So we're dealing with a very complex thing here. Embodiment is further constituted by the manner in which self and others represent the body, drawing on local categories, obviously, of knowledge and experience. And if embodiment is to be made social, then one must also relate to local culture, to language, local knowledge, and these days, in many places, to scientific knowledge relevant to what is happening. So the bottom line here for me is that the primary site that we as anthropologists are engaged in, and we'll see later when we go on and talk about epigenetics, that this is important, that the primary site where we anthropologists should be concerned is the subjectively experienced body, and to situate that subjectivity because epigenetics is not interested in subjective experience. Epigenetics is a science. So the material body cannot be assumed to be a universal layered over so much socio-cultural flotsam. These are entangled, deeply entangled one with the other, and it's very, very hard to separate them out without doing and keep justice to what is going on, to be an explanatory justice. Excuse me. You can easily lose control in trying to explain this kind of stuff. So let me give you just one other totally different example of how it's been used more recently, and that is by a wonderful Danish anthropologist called Tina Gammeltoft. And she worked in Vietnam recently, and she has been working with Vietnamese families in North Vietnam, which was sprayed, as everybody or most people remember, with Agent Orange for years during the Vietnam War. Widely sprayed. And what has happened a generation later is that numerous infants are being born with fetal abnormalities, or the fetus have abnormalities. The infant being born has brain damage. They have hydrocephalus, deformed brains, with and they die. They're very, very handicapped, and they die at a young age. This happens everywhere in the world occasionally, but it's happening at far too great a rate in Vietnam for it to be anything else other than caused by Agent Orange, which still lingers. Plus, American servicemen, their children have been affected as well, back in the States. She uses the concept of local biologies to explain this, and I think she uses it in a very, very appropriate way. This is a particular major event that happened, and equivalents would be the dropping of the nuclear bomb in Hiroshima, Chernobyl, and so on. These are places where you get local biologies which can persist for years and years and years in one way or another. It's been used in all sorts of other ways too, but this is a very, very striking example, this Vietnamese example. And I think that local biologies continues to be a very useful concept, but a good number of us have now also moved to incorporating the idea of situated biologies which encompass local biologies. In other words, biology everywhere depends on the environment. Darwin and on, right? Biology depends on the environment. So we've always known, we anthropologists are taught about differences in high altitudes, and people living in high altitudes have different their use of oxygen is different, and people very well living in the far north have different metabolism and ingest very different food, which it leads to a different biological metabolism. It's partly a survival strategy in the cold and so on. So anthropologists, biological anthropologists particularly, of course, have always been comfortable with the idea of biological difference. But even we social and cultural anthropologists are taught a little of this when we're learning anthropology, and recognize that there is that kind of difference. And if you start to look more closely, you find that the form that sickle cell anemia takes in Africa varies depending on the kind of mosquito and the kind of landscape, and you look everywhere and you see biological difference all over the place. So we have to think of situated biologies as being something overall arching concept under which local biologies occur in specific sites where specific things have happened. In the case of Japan, it's to do with long-term dietary practices. And this will be the case in many parts of the world, no doubt, but we haven't really started looking at that sufficiently. Or alternatively, it's to do with various toxic events such as Vietnam and the like. This I think of as, this is a concept that I am now, but other people too are now writing about and thinking about very seriously as we need a new theoretical approach to how we as anthropologists are going to handle this elusive concept of biology that causes so much trouble. We obviously need to make clear that we are not using it in the basic biological sense. We're using it in its lived experience sense, which is very, very different. Another way in which it's been used recently is by a woman, Teresa Theoden, who has worked in Peru in Colombia. And she has looked at the way in which there was a huge amount of violence and rape, of course, between the rebels and local people, and a huge amount of violence. And the resulting trauma she sees as, or interprets as, one kind of illustration of local biology specific to that ongoing conflict in Colombia, which hopefully now possibly has come to an end. And then the other big one that I write about a lot, for which we need more research, but is the intergenerational debilitating effects of colonialism. And I've written quite a bit about First Nations and the long-lasting impact which Canadians, of course, are getting good information in the media about these long-term impacts. And it seems to me, and again we'll get to this in epigenetics, that there is the intergenerational transmission of what is called historic trauma, which is reproduced in the cell memories in the bodies of the next generation and the next generation. It's extraordinarily important and interesting. And the epigeneticists are not going to document this. This is the work for anthropologists to do with First Nations themselves. Really, really important. So, and then there's just very recently, there's a new term that has come up. We are now officially in the age of the Anthropocene. I don't know whether you have read that, but the geologists have decided that we are in the age of the Anthropocene. And what characterizes the Anthropocene is that it's the first geological epoch in which humans have made such an impact on the environment that we are transforming the environment at such a rate that the first explosion of the explosion of the first atomic bomb is the sign, the hard sign that the geologists take as being officially pushing us into the era of the Anthropocene, because that fallout will remain in the rocks and in the sediment forever. So we have transformed the world forever with that bomb. And of course, we're doing more and more worse and worse things. And so certain medical anthropologists or ordinary anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, have already moved to the idea of exposed biologies, in that, for example, in a country like China, people are living in toxic environments from top to bottom all the time, from in utero on. In other words, they are exposed to toxic biologies. So a new concept of exposed biologies, and for example, in a place like China, it is now recognized both by the Chinese government and by local people everywhere that they are exposed to toxic environments from the time of in utero on. And it shows, of course, in the health and illness of people all over the country. So we now have this kind of layered concept of biologies, the broadest and most encompassing of which is this new idea of exposed biologies, that in not just in China, in India and in other parts of the world, increasingly, the environment is so toxic that it's just not possible to remain healthy in those conditions. And then underneath that is the situated biologies that I explained earlier, and then the smallest unit would be the local biologies. So they're all nested one into the other, and because all of this deals with the environment, and we'll come to this later on, I think and feel strongly that anthropologists must get engaged. Because, as we'll see later, the basic scientists do not deal with the environment the way we would, and they certainly don't deal with the people in these environments the way we would.